Okay. Whew. Hmm. All right, I guess that's okay. I'm a little crooked, but I don't really know. I don't have a manual for this thing, and I'm not sure how to make that uncrooked, honestly. I'm not sure what. Help a little bit. No, I'm still crooked. Yeah, I don't really know. I don't know what the secret is with that. Oh well. Okay, now I'm in Exodus. I haven't gotten around to doing one of these in a few days, longer than I want. It took a longer break than I wanted to, for a variety of reasons, but I'm back again. So now we're here on starting in the book of Exodus. These are the names of the sons of Israel who went to Egypt with Jacob, each with his family. Excuse me. Reuben, Simeon, Levi, and Judah, Issachar, Zebulun, and Benjamin, Dan and Naphtali, Gad and Asher. Again, they're arranging the brothers by their mothers, not necessarily in straight birth order. The descendants of Jacob numbered 70 in all. Joseph was already in Egypt. If you'll notice, there's a footnote at that 70 mark, because some they're in the, well, let me go ahead and read it. The Masoretic texts, which is one of our old copies of the scriptures, the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the Septuagint, also Acts 7:14, say 75. That just depends on if you count. There's a few others. I forget exactly. I don't know if they're counting Joseph's number in there or what. But those extra 5, there are an extra 5 people that may or may not be counted in that list. Man, kind of bugs me. I guess I'm looking at myself in the image up there, and I guess it looks okay. But when I look at it, like I see it's crooked, and I wish I understood how to change that without snapping it, but I don't. I'll figure that out maybe someday. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died. Joseph was 110. We saw that at the end of Genesis. Joseph was the 11th of the 12 brothers, but apparently he had some of his brothers, several of his older brothers outlived him, because he was talking to them, according to the end of Genesis, about what to do with his body. Remember, they wouldn't have been that much older than him. We talked earlier about the timeline of Jacob's sons being born. Those first 11 sons were all born within a few years of each other with 4 different women. So, yeah, he would have been one of the youngest ones, but the second youngest one. But the age difference between him and the others wouldn't have been that great. So that generation died. They're all gone. But the Israelites were fruitful and multiplied greatly and became exceedingly numerous, so that the land was filled with them. That's exactly what God told Adam and Eve to do in the garden. It's what he told Noah, well, really, Noah's sons and their wives to do after they got out of the ark. It's what he promised to do for Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and he's doing it. So the Israelites are multiplying greatly. Now, this is not taking place over as long a period of time as we often believe. As I have mentioned before already, the Israelites were not in Egypt for all 400 of those years. That 400-year figure, or 430-year figure, includes the time... What are you doing, Kat? Oh my goodness, what are you doing? Oh no. Oh no. Includes the time Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob spent wandering around in Canaan before Jacob and his family went down to Egypt. So they were only in Egypt for about 210 years. And a good chunk of those years, Joseph was still alive for. Joseph was in Egypt. Well, he became the vizier of Egypt at age 30. Jacob and the rest of the family moved down when Joseph was 39. Joseph lived to be 110. So Joseph himself, the family was in Egypt with Joseph during Joseph's lifetime for another 71 years. So of those 210 years, 70 of them, about a third, Joseph was alive for. So they weren't. So this is not taking place. We often think of them being enslaved for 400 years, but this is not taking place over as long a period of time. And Moses himself will be born, then he'll be 80 when they finally leave. So in between the death of, I'm sorry, there's a cat, this troublemaking cat is right here, and I am got to keep an eye on her. What are you doing, cat? So Moses was born 80 years before they finally left. Okay, at least she's up there now. I'm sorry. Moses was born 80 years before they left. Joseph died, and then they were in. Okay, let me reset. Let me reset all that. When they went down to Egypt when Joseph was 39. Joseph lived, and they lived in Egypt for a total of 210, I think it was, years. Joseph lived 71 more years after the rest of the family moved down to Egypt. So that takes us down to 149 years between Joseph's death and their departure. Moses himself was 80 when they left. So he was only born about 70-ish years, 60, 70-ish, we were up to 70, 70-ish years after Joseph died. Now 70 years is actually a pretty long time. Okay, you go back 70 years now, you get to 1950. When I was growing up, 1950 was only about 30 years ago. Now 1950 is 70 years ago. 70 years is a fairly long time, but we often think of them being slaves, and of course they were also slaves for an additional 80 years after Moses was born. So we often think about them being slaves for all 400 of those years. That's not the case. It's hard to say exactly how long they were slaves because we don't know at what point exactly during that 70-year break between Joseph's death and Moses' birth they were enslaved. Whether it was closer to Joseph's death or closer to Moses' birth, we really don't know. But Moses' lifetime, of course, they were enslaved for the first 80 years of that, and then for some unknown number of years before that. But they couldn't have been enslaved for more than 140 years total. And possibly a little bit less than that. That's a long time. Okay, that's a long time. That's long enough for multiple generations to grow up only knowing slavery. But we often think of them being enslaved for over 400 years, and that's actually not the case. And they did all this growing and all this multiplying in in this fairly short amount of time. Now that probably started as soon as they got into Egypt, so they had the rest of Joseph's lifespan and following. But they did all this growing, all this multiplying within a couple of centuries, not within 4 centuries. Anyway, then a new king who did not know about Joseph came to power in Egypt. Now this new king is often thought of as being a member of a new ruling dynasty. Remember how I talked about in our previous lessons, as I kind of gave the overview of Egypt's history, that we divide up Egypt's history in terms of its dynasties. And of course we know what dynasties are. We're familiar with England and the dynasties of England in the European Middle Ages. And so we kind of transplant that knowledge back onto Egyptian dynasties. Doesn't work exactly. They're not a one-to-one match, but it's close enough, roughly the same. And so we often think about it. So when you read about this and people try to figure out where Exodus fits in history, we often hear at this point, it's often taught that this is a new dynasty. I actually don't think that's the case. I think Israel's entire time in Egypt can be found within the 12th dynasty of the Middle Kingdom. Now, normally, if you look up the 12th dynasty pharaohs, you'll get their dates being somewhere in the 1900s, 1800s BC, which is way too soon for Joseph and for the Exodus. But that is not necessarily because there's a problem with the history. There's a problem with our timeline of the history. And that's true for all of our ancient history. We date all of our ancient history studies after Egypt's timeline, which causes problems all throughout. We don't really like to talk about it because it's kind of embarrassing. But that 3 or 4 century gap, we've extended. The crux of the matter is that we have extended Egyptian history 300 or 400 years longer than it should be. So, for example, the 12th dynasty pharaohs, probably instead of them being in the 1900s to the 1700s or so BC, should probably be dated down to the 1600s to the 1400s BC, which is right during the time when when Israel was in Egypt. If we do that, we'll find that the histories actually match up very, very well together. And you go on down the line and you shrink all of Egypt's dates down about 300 years, and you'll find that all of Egypt's history now fits in very snugly with Israelite history and with histories of the other nations of the ancient world. For some reason, we don't do that, and not just Israel, but all the Israel nations around Israel, and even going up into Greece, even going up into the European states that had trade, Mediterranean trade with Egypt and other nations. So it's like that 300 year or so gap of history that is caused by our extending of Egyptian history longer than it should be is a problem for our ancient studies in general. Now, again, you're not going to hear this acknowledged very often because it's embarrassing, frankly. It's something that we'd rather not talk about because it throws into question our own highly enlightened, intelligent conclusions, which we love to be so confident in. We love our own knowledge. That's one of the things about Europeans that has always been true. Paul noticed this when he went to Athens. The early church noticed this when they went into Europe and started witnessing to the European Gentiles there. Europeans have always been very fond of their own knowledge. Paul says in 1 Corinthians that Jews look for miraculous signs and Greeks look for wisdom. There's something about being impressed with our own smarts that we've been in love with ourselves over since the days of Socrates. Okay, that's just how it is. Anyway, so we don't really like to acknowledge it because it's embarrassing to admit that we're not completely correct about our understanding of ancient history. But essentially, that's the problem. So anyway, back to the point. A lot of times, a lot of times you'll hear that this is a new dynasty coming into power. It doesn't actually say that. It literally, I think, just means it's a new king who didn't personally know Joseph. He may have known about him. He may have heard about him at some point in his life. But I think it was just a new king that just did not know him, had not met him, their paths never crossed, and it was just a new guy. Now, one of the reasons why we often say this is a new dynasty is because one of the old theories, it might be even still, some people may still believe this. I've heard it taught this way. Now, I don't believe this any longer, but let me say it this way. During a period of Egyptian history, the Egyptians, were dominated by a series of foreign kings that we call the Hyksos. It basically means shepherd kings. They were foreigners that came from the Asiatic region and came in and conquered Egypt and ruled them for a while. And so and they were shepherd kings. And so some people believe that Joseph's Pharaoh was one of those foreigners, which would help explain then why that Pharaoh was so predisposed to trust Joseph, another foreigner, and put so much control under him. And also why that Pharaoh didn't seem to be as repulsed by shepherds as most Egyptians were, because he was a shepherd king Pharaoh. I don't think that's true. I think there are other explanations about why that particular Pharaoh was responsive to Joseph at that particular time. I believe that Pharaoh was Senuseret I, whose father had been the victim of a conspiracy to have assassination. And I believe that he was not a member of the foreigner ruling pharaohs. I believe those guys didn't come into Egypt until after the Israelites left. In fact, I believe it was the plagues and the destruction of the army in the Red Sea which created the opening that allowed the foreign rulers to come into Egypt in the first place. So I don't think that's the case. So a lot of times, how this will be explained is that it was a foreign ruler dynasty that was in control of Egypt when Israel went there, and then the Egyptians regained their power, and this is a member of a new dynasty. Because of our date, remember how I said the Exodus can be very solidly dated to 1446 BC. And a lot of, and if you look at our timeline of Egyptian history, the dynasty that would have been in control during that time would have been, I believe, the 18th dynasty, which was the dynasty that started after they kicked the foreign rulers out of Egypt and unified the whole country under a single native pharaoh again. The 18th dynasty was also a very expansionist dynasty, the 18th and 19th dynasties, and undertook significant military operations outside of Egypt. That makes that there's no room there whatsoever for the Moses story or for the story of the Exodus or the 40 years of wandering. But we have that period of Egyptian history dated to the 1400s, which is when this is supposed to happen. And part of the reason why we have so much trouble is that when we study the history of that dynasty, we see absolutely no overlap whatsoever with the history that's being recorded here. But so rather than question whether or not we're right in our dating of that history, we just assume this has to be wrong. Even though it was partially because of some of the tidbits of history revealed here that we constructed this timeline, in the first place, which I'll mention in just a moment. So, at any rate, I don't believe this is representing a change in dynasties here. I believe this is simply a new king in the same dynasty, a king or two later, who simply never met Joseph. Look, he said to his people, the Israelites have become much too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous. And if war breaks out, they will join our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. Now, he's actually giving the Israelites more credit here than they deserve. These Israelites, as we'll find out later, as we'll see empirically demonstrated later, are not a warfaring people and would almost certainly not, in a million years, have fought against the Egyptians on behalf of some invading army. So his paranoia here, his fear, is completely unjustified, at least according to the Israel, at least based on what we see of the Israelites' behavior later on. At any rate, he is instead of investigating the matter properly and determining whether or not his fear of the Israelites is justified, which I don't believe it was, he is going to act as though it is and deal shrewdly with them. I'm not really sure what, I mean, we'll find out he's going to be putting slave masters over them. I don't even know how that means, dealing shrewdly. I'm not really sure what deal shrewdly is supposed to mean. It doesn't seem to me like there's anything shrewd about enslaving someone, but cats. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. Now, this is one of those big things that caused us lots of problems. One of our early mistakes in dating Egyptian history is we saw this word Ramesses here. Now there's a pharaoh named actually there's a bunch of pharaohs that have this name, this throne name of Ramesses, from the 19th dynasty. Of course, the major one is Ramesses the Great, which was, I believe, Ramesses II. When we talk about Ramesses, we're usually talking about him. There were, I think, like 9 kings or something like that had the name Ramesses. So there's a whole bunch of Ramesses. Ramesses III, IV. I think there's like 9 of them. But when we talk about Ramesses, we typically talk about, I think it was the second one, Ramesses II, otherwise known as Ramesses the Great. And he reigned for 67 years, I believe. I don't know if he was the longest reigning pharaoh of Egypt, but he was one of them. 67 years, was, did all these kinds of, great things, military things and all that, building things. In that world, in that culture, there were two ways a king could become great. He could win a lot of battles, or he could build a lot of buildings, basically. Those are the two things that defined your greatness as a king back in those days. And of course, it was very common when you built a city or a building, you named it after yourself. I mean, that's very, very common. Cain did that way back in Genesis 4. He built a city and named it after his son. Um, Very, very common in the ancient world to build a city and name it after either you or your son, or maybe sometimes your god. Especially if you, like Ramesses itself, I forget the exact name. Like part of it, we pronounce it Ramesses. Part of the word there is Ra, which is their sun god Ra. And I don't know if it means son of Ra or what it means, but all of these king names had some form of acknowledgement of their deities in them. And most of the time, in Egypt, they claimed to be the deities. In Egypt, the idea was that the pharaoh was the personification of the god. Now, not every culture had that belief. Some of them, the king was simply the appointed ruler of the god. In some cases, he'd be the son of God, which I believe, as I said before, goes all the way back to Genesis 6, and we read about the sons of God mating with the daughters of men. I believe these sons of God are self-appointed titles that evil rulers are taking upon themselves to justify their claim of rulership, basically. And everybody did that. It was always some version of that. Either you were the God himself in human form, or you were the son of God, or at the very least, you were the divinely appointed, chosen servant of God. And that was true everywhere. Everywhere, 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 that was true. And that would stay that way for a long time. I mean, divine right of kings is a concept that has been persistent throughout human history. I mean, even I guess it wasn't last year, but even a couple of years ago, Donald Trump claimed to be the Messiah or the chosen one of God. So it's a very, very common thread throughout human history. I mean, we have to derive our authority from somewhere. If we're going to have a government system set up, if we're going to have men in charge of other men, if we're going to have an authority system in place, somehow or another, that authority entity needs to derive its authority from somewhere. There needs to be a justification for why a certain group of people or a certain man or a certain woman is in charge and other people are not. At some point, that has to be explained. At some point, that chain of command has to be justified. And it was ubiquitous all throughout the ancient world, and even long beyond that, it was extremely common for that authority to be based in some sort of divine claim of, well, God put me here. God chose me. God appointed me. I am God, maybe. I'm just a manifestation of God or the Son of God. That was an extremely common claim all throughout history. Anyway, back to the point. People saw this word Ramesses here, and they assumed it was a city that Ramesses had built for himself. And so they figured then that this must be Ramesses. The Pharaoh doing this, therefore, must be Ramesses. If you watch the Ten Commandments movie from back in the day, the Pharaoh in that movie is Ramesses. Because a common belief back in the 1800s or so, whenever they first found this stuff, was that the Pharaoh Ramesses forced the Israelites to build this city and named it after himself. Well, that's actually not the case. Okay, this word Ramesses is in this text probably because at some point later in time, in the days of Josiah maybe, or some other time, an editor or a copyist went through here and copied the text. Moses' original documents, his original parchments or scrolls, whatever he wrote on, are long gone. Okay, we'll get to that later on as we read about Moses actually writing this down as it was happening. But the actual original copy that Moses would have left with them is gone. Okay, it's been gone for thousands of years. All we've had, and all we have had for thousands of years, is copies of this document. And so at some point during time, probably maybe in the days of Josiah, when they did a lot of the compiling of their texts, some copyist, some scribe who was copying an old, making a newer copy of an older copy, came across this word, came across this sentence here in Hebrew, and rather than writing down the word that was originally recorded there, he put in the word Ramesses because that was the name of that city at that time. So let's say that some scribe in Josiah's reign in 630 BC is writing this down. He has a copy or a century or two older than his, and he's writing it down. He comes to this name, and whatever word is there, he replaces it with Ramesses because that's the name that city goes by in his day. And that is, in turn, what has come down to us as the ultimate edition of these scriptures. Now, I'm not one of those people who thinks that the whole thing was patched together by priests hundreds of years after they happened, but I do believe that there were updates and edits, relatively minor, but still they exist, that were put into the text by copyists at a later point in time. And I believe this happens here. So this word Ramesses is covering up a word that used to be there that was not Ramesses. Ramesses did build this city as a store city, but there was a city underneath it that was already there. In fact, those Hyksos people I talked about, those foreign kings that ruled Egypt for a while, actually used this city as their capital. It was called Avaris in those days. And it wasn't even new when they built it. It had been built before they even got there. And so the original city that the Israelites built was a mud brick city that's at the bottom of all of this. And that was not named Ramesses at the time they built it. But at the time that this copyist put this final text that we ended up having to this day into form, he wrote the word Ramesses there. So that was a major part of our problem in dating all of this stuff to begin with, because we saw this word Ramesses, we connected it with the Pharaoh Ramesses the Great to be specific. We assumed that this must be that Pharaoh, so that this then must be taking place in that time frame. And none of that is true.